Chrontendo is back, and it's the holiday season of 1987. Yes, we finally reached November. In the US, the big news is a toy company deciding to take the plunge into console gaming, and releasing 3 games based on movies. Thus, the flood of US licensed Nintendo games begins. In Japan, the big game this time is probably the Famicom port of the largest selling Japanese computer game. It was published by Hudson, who also have a rather unusual surprise in store this time around. And also we have the promised follow-up to the 1987 computer game Roundup. This time we're taking a look at the big arcade video games of 1987. But first, let's start off with some arcade ports. We've got a big 5 games released at the very end of October, so let's get this one out of the way first. Joust is the 3rd and final of Hal's series of ports of old US arcade games. Once again, the same music and that weird copyright to Atari. In case anyone out there doesn't know Joust, it was a very successful 1982 arcade game from Midway. In it you control an armored knight mounted on a flying ostrich. You attempt to collide with the other knights, but you must do so at a higher elevation to win the fight. Your opponent's ostrich will then drop an egg which you must collect, otherwise the knight will rehatch after a minute. For those of you with excellent memories, you might remember Nintendo's game Balloon Fight, covered way back in Chrontendo 2. It was pretty clearly based on Joust. Well, as far as home versions go, Hal's Joust ain't that hot. Joust is very much based around the game's physics, with your ostrich having weight and momentum. Learning to control and maneuver your ostrich is the key thing to beating your opponents. But everything seems a little off here. One very odd thing is the way your bird bounces around the platforms like they were pinball bumpers or something. Just as with Millipede and Defender, the title screen and the character sprites have been altered for the US version. Once again, I'm at a complete loss why, unless Hal simply felt the need to add a bit more detail to the graphics. The original Joust is a cool game, so it's too bad they weren't able to pull this off a little better. So with that out of the way, let's move on to a better arcade port. And it's another FDS title from Taito, and also an arcade port, much like August Kiki Kai Kai. Today, however, we have Bobble, a port of Taito's arcade game of a much more recent vintage than Joust. Bobble is sort of a follow-up to the game Chack and Pop, the Famicom port of which we covered back in Chrontendo 3. It's like it's Nostalgia Week here at Chrontendo. Your dragon character made his first appearance in that game. Unlike Kiki Kai Kai, Bobble, I sense sort of a pattern in Taito's names of these games, is a very straightforward port. The game has not been given any sort of RPG makeover or anything like that. Despite being a relatively modern game from 1986, Bobble is a very sort of deliberately old-fashioned sort of game, harkening back to the kind of games that were popular back when the Famicom was first released. Falls into the sort of Dig-Dug Bomberman style of game, where your character attempts to kill enemies using some sort of unique method of execution. Once you've cleared the screen of enemies, you're on to the next screen. In Bubble's case, rather than air pumps or bombs, it's, bubbles, obviously. You blow bubbles at the monsters, which will then become trapped in the bubbles and slowly float upwards. You must then pop the bubble, sending the monsters to their doom. Various bonus items appear, and from time to time, well actually that's pretty much all there really is. Taito's port was also released in the US on a cartridge, and is still a pretty much perfect conversion. It looks almost exactly like the original arcade game. By 1986 standards, the arcade Bobble had very simple graphics. I mean, it really could have been released in 1983 and, it looked about the same. So as a result of the game's sort of, lack of being a cutting-edge graphical kind of game, the Famicom was able to reproduce it with rather only an insignificant loss of detail. A few things have been changed, but Bobble was one of the very few sort of perfect arcade conversions coming out at this time. I mentioned the Sega Master System's Wonder Boy as being one of the very rare examples of a dead-on arcade port. Bobble is long, over 100 levels, and some are actually very hard, like that one we saw a second ago with all the enemies firing like lasers down at you. You have to get to the top of the screen, which is really tough. At times you'll have to execute some clever moves, for example blowing a bubble and then jumping on it in order to get to higher levels. At the very end there is a boss. His name is actually, get this, Super Drunk, and he throws bottles. Unfortunately, I'm not really good enough at Bubble Bobble to actually defeat him. Well, oh well. Overall, Bubble Bobble is a very accurate port of a fun and fondly remembered arcade classic. It's really sort of one of the last of the old school style arcade games. It's hard to imagine how Taito could screw this one up too badly, but it is nice that they actually put a lot of effort into this. Man, HAL makes a pretty bad showing this episode. As we've seen, Nintendo is now outsourcing most of its sports games to HAL, with one big exception, which we'll discuss later this episode. And now here we have another HAL-developed game from Nintendo, Famicom Grand Prix F1 Race. Unfortunately, this is probably the least playable racing game we've seen for the system so far. Famicom Grand Prix is, I suppose, a follow-up to the system's first racing game, F1 Race from 1984. There is a sort of a bit of racing simulation added into this game. You use the money to buy better and better cars. Of course, to get money you have to win races. So you start by buying your car, and there's a few other options as well. And this being an FTS game, you can actually save your progress. Now upon starting a race, you need to select which of your cars you want to drive. And this was actually a pretty forward-thinking idea. Nowadays, racing games will let you own a whole garage full of vehicles, but in 1987 this is not something you saw in other console racing games. There was a total of 4 tracks in this game. It's rather unfortunate that this game was released so quickly after Square's Rad Racer, since Famicom Grand Prix suffers in comparison. Surprisingly, this is a top-down perspective, rather than the more contemporary 3D viewpoint favored by a lot of other games like Rad Racer, and even the 1984 F1 race. This does seem like kind of an odd decision, since top-down racing games tended to be associated with early arcade racing games. Post-pole position top-down racing games started falling out of favor, though we will occasionally see that game with isometric perspective like Rare's RC Pro-Am or Rock and Roll Racing. Regardless, this does give the game sort of an old-fashioned feel to it. Actual gameplay is extremely simple. You have 2 buttons, one to accelerate in low gear, and the other for high gear. There's no brake. Use your D-pad to steer your car. Handling is a bit shaky. Much like Shalom, the car's control feels very digital, meaning your car can only point in a limited number of directions. That is, if you touch the right on the D-pad, your car will suddenly turn a set number of degrees. Thus, you can't control your vehicle very precisely. Of course, the tracks only run straight up and down, or sideways, or diagonally at 45-degree angles. Still, trying to cleanly round corners or recover from an error can be pretty tricky due to the lack of simply being able to fine-tune your turns. Another aspect of the game is the damage that your car takes. Whenever you hit something, or whenever you drive on the grass, or just drive much at all, quite frankly, your tires will slowly take damage. Once your tire's strength have gone down to 0, you will start skidding and sliding all over the place, and your car will become impossible to control. At this point, you will need to definitely get into the pit and have the tires and the car repaired. One other interesting thing, there was a contest based around this game, kind of like the earlier golf game. Folks with good scores get a limited edition F1 Grand Prix Game & Watch game. Well, it's too bad this game is not better. Interestingly, in the US, Nintendo decided to skip this game and actually released Rad Racer themselves. We now have 2 games up from the Japanese book and magazine publisher Tokyo Shoseki today, Family Composer and Romancia. We'll start with the less interesting of the 2. Presumably Musical Plan is the company that developed this. Tokyo Shoseki is one company that seems to have no fear of repeating itself, since this is the second virtual music studio title they've released. The first was Ikinari Musician back in March of '87. That game was also copywritten to Musical Plan. I don't know if you remember Ikinari Musician, I barely do myself, but it had this little rabbit theme going on, little dancing rabbits would appear in spots. I guess Family Composer is a more serious version of the earlier release. It works somewhat like a real synthesizer. You can select a rhythm, add music, record, playback, and so on. The pencil tool allows you to note the score, and then you can listen to it being played. I guess this is sort of like a cool kind of thing to sort of fool around with. But just like I said about Ikinari Musician, Someone with musical talent might have a good time with this and be able to create something interesting, but for folks like me, it's just going to have to be a toy that sort of makes some noise. Now there are a couple different modes here. This one right here, I can't quite seem to figure out. You have a little tape player that you can sort of speed up and slow things down, but I have not yet been able to actually determine what this is supposed to do. Our second Tokyo Shoseki game is a little different. Alright, it's completely different. Incredibly, it's a port of Nihon Falcom's computer game Dragon Slayer Jr., Romancia. That's right, we've seen the Dragon Slayer series before, with Dragon Slayer 4, aka Legacy of the Wizard. That horribly cruel game from Namco in which your little family explored an absurdly large and confusing castle, looking for something. Now we saw a bit of Romancia back then. It was originally released in 1986. Here is the MSX1 version. Sometimes called an RPG, it's really more of a proto-RPG. Sort of a side-scrolling hack and slash, in which you need to do a lot of fetch quests. And it was, of course, the third in the Dragon Slayer series, number 2 being Xanadu. Not exactly a very good-looking game, but tolerable, I suppose, by those early MSX standards. And just by comparison, here's the MSX2 version. I guess this is the nice way to sort of compare the capabilities between the two generations of MSX computers. Either way, the game is not exactly nice. There's a 30-minute time limit and no way to save your game or continue. Trial and error factor very heavily into gameplay. The game starts you off exploring this rather large village, but even here you're not exactly completely safe of danger and you can't really fool around too much. For example, if you talk to this one guy who's sitting on a cloud, he'll actually kill you. Yes, that's very nice. Now naturally for the Famicom version, they have changed it around a bit. Now first of all, we're going to be seeing the unofficial English translation from DVD translations. And the first thing to note is that a completely new beginning has been added. And by the way, the Famicom version was ported by none other than our good buddies at Compile. However, they decided to stay true to the philosophy of the original and made a game that sort of hates you and wants you to fail. In this new opening sequence, you are bombarded with enemies that are almost impossible to hit, and flying creatures that go around unreachable above your head and then dive bomb you directly from an angle your sword cannot reach. And if you move out of their way, they then dive beneath you and then come back up and hit you from underneath. And of course they attack in groups. They sometimes drop health refills and form like a little teeny tiny heart, but if you accidentally hit the heart with your sword, it vanishes, and it's hard to avoid hitting the hearts while you're fighting enemies. Basically you have to kill a whole bunch of those, then you'll get some kind of magic stone that will allow you to enter this next little cave. A few minutes of this and you get to the first boss. Not sure what exactly that guy is throwing at you. Looks like wedges of cheese or something. He's not that tough as long as you've saved your long-range projectile swords. You can just stand at one side and just fire swords at him forever. Of course, if you've used up all your swords, he's going to be pretty darn tough. Now after him, you're going to be at the beginning of the original game. To give you an idea of Nihon Falcom's intentions, the king is in the castle behind a wall with a hidden door. Yet, the very first thing you encounter is an invisible door. I mean, Dragon Quest started you standing right off next to the king, but here, nope. You have to start looking for hidden stuff immediately. Now the town is cursed and everyone is ill, and the exit is blocked, naturally. In order to leave, you need to go on sorts of various little fetch quests and find various hidden items. You'll need to do things like press the levers at the bottom of that lake to get a key. You find some hidden areas with helpful items, and then you get medicine from a priest. Of course, you can only carry one flask of medicine at a time, and you'll want to heal everyone in order to get some helpful items, so you'll need to do a lot of walking from one end of the town to the other. First thing to do is to jump the medicine into the well and cure the village's water. And that's essentially what the entire game is, finding a ton of items and then figuring out how to use them. I certainly hope the original Japanese instruction manual is huge, since none of the items have any sort of in-game description. You find rings, crosses, robes, scrolls, all of which come to with absolutely no hint as to what they're actually for. So Romancia is basically sort of like a smaller version of Legacy of the Wizard. Oh yeah, and there's this guy again. Once again, talk to him, and he'll send you to heaven. In other words, kill you. Not really fair for a game with no saves or continues. Later there is a way to get to heaven without dying, but no one in the game is going to tell you that. Mostly, Romancia is all about sadism. Having moved on to the next town, you come across a canyon you can't jump across, but luckily there is a rather invisible tunnel. Oh, and here I'm actually going to heaven the correct way, not by dying. Even on the way to heaven, things attack you. Much of what Romancia is seems to be sort of pointlessly obscure and repetitive. I mean, there are some cool moments like going to heaven, where your character gets little sort of angel wings and halo, and at some point I picked up a scroll, which is cursed. Luckily a guy in heaven can remove the curse, sort of, and then you'll need to use that scroll to get past a roadblock later in the game. Romancia is actually quite good at stopping your progress until you find some particular object. Furthermore, the game world is too small and requires too much running back and forth over the same stretch of land. Prince Fan Freddy controls sluggishly and has awful pre-Mario jumping controls. His sword has virtually no reach, so combat's a pain. These are all issues you might expect from a Japanese computer game of Romancia's vintage, but you would hope the Famicom port would offer some sort of improvements. Unfortunately, Compile failed to make this game any more playable. Luckily, we have another game that succeeds, where Romancia failed. As I mentioned some episodes ago, Hudson Soft had been developing a new chipset for use in a video game console, one much more powerful than the chips powering the Famicom or the Sega Master System. Hudson partnered with NEC, the huge Japanese electronics company. These were the guys who also made the PC-88 and PC-98 computers. Then, on October 30th, a bombshell hit the Japanese computer game scene with the release of the PC Engine. This new console would officially kick off the next generation of home video game machines. So in essence, the 16-bit era had begun, which is odd since many folks consider the PC Engine and its US counterpart, the TurboGrafx-16, to technically be 8-bit machines. Of course, that didn't really matter once you turned the thing on. The first set of games released by Hudson were not that impressive gameplay-wise, but man, the graphics demonstrated the hardware's awesome capabilities. The Kung Fu, known as China Warrior in the US, featured absurdly huge detailed sprites, amazing for the time. The PC Engine was quite successful in Japan, but oddly, this really didn't sour Hudson's relationship with Nintendo. They continued to release games for both consoles. As promised, we will be launching a sister series dedicated to the console, Chronturbo. The PC Engine is a great system and has many hidden gems and oddities, so I'm pretty excited. Expect the first episode sometime in the near future. Alright kids, before we move on to November, we've got one little last game. Yep, it's one of the all-time favorites from back in the day, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! What do I even say about this game? It's one that needs no introduction, I suppose. The plot as it exists is quite simple. Vertically challenged boxer Little Mac must defeat a series of other fighters in order to take the World Championship. And playing the role of Little Mac, it's you! I suppose that's a rather clumsy way of describing the process by which a player puts himself into the character of a video game protagonist. As I've mentioned earlier, the opening fanfare music has also been used in HAL's recent ports of old arcade games, such as Joust. HAL worked on a number of Nintendo sports titles, but Punch-Out is not usually counted among them, so I'm sort of at a loss for an explanation for this. As with many Nintendo sports titles, Mario has been sort of shoehorned into the game. Now, the most obviously striking thing about Punch-Out is the exceptionally large sprites used for your opponents, and the rather detailed animations they're giving. Glass Joe is about 1/3 as tall as the screen is high, and some of the larger fighters are actually closer to 1/2 of the screen height. Each character has a very large number of individual poses. You wouldn't really describe the fighters in Punch-Out as realistic, but they do resemble animated cartoon characters to a certain extent. Most video game characters back then had about maybe 3 to 4 different sprites used for animating the movements. If you compare the boxers in Punch-Out to pretty much any contemporary video game bosses, you'll see just how much detail was put in making them lifelike. Now, unlike every other Nintendo-produced game we've seen in the last couple years, Punch-Out is in fact an arcade port. The original Punch-Out from 1984 used a weird double-screen layout, much like Nintendo's PlayChoice arcade cabinets. I actually guess it resembled a giant DS. Everything old comes around again, I suppose. The game was notable for its excellent speech samples. Going into arcade at the time, you'd hear people playing Punch-Out with, body blow, uppercut, piercing through all the typical video game sound effects. The arcade game plays a lot differently than the more familiar NES version, and is more of a standard boxing game. Also impressive for the time the fact that each boxer had sort of like their own distinct personality, and they felt more like actual characters rather than typical generic video game bad guys. Nintendo quickly followed up with Super Punch-Out the same year. Really, it's the same game with new characters. Some, but not all of these characters would find their way into the NES Punch-Out. After the second game, a semi-sequel came out in 1985, Arm Wrestling. This virtually forgotten title isn't important for one thing in particular: it marks Nintendo's exit from traditional arcade games. Now, the first home release of Punch-Out was a limited edition gold cartridge given out to players of the Famicom golf game who submitted their highest scores. Obviously, this card is quite hard to find and pricey now. The Japanese gold cart, as we see the game here, was simply entitled Punch-Out and was virtually identical to the later US releases, but did not feature any mention of Mike Tyson. Well, anyway, back to the US version. Punch-Out was intended to be a big title. It was previewed in Nintendo Fun Club News number 3 and featured on the cover of number 4. Along with Super Mario and Zelda, it became what would be called a killer app for the NES. Now, scoring Mike Tyson's name and image for the game was a pretty huge coup. In 1987, Tyson was the new heavyweight boxing champion and had become one of the most famous athletes in the world. Having won almost every fight of his professional career by knockout, often in the first round, Tyson qualified as one of the first superstar boxers the sport had seen for quite a while. He was then added in as the final opponent in Punch-Out, and then given a US release in October 1987 as Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. The game was then later given a general release in Japan in November. Now, Nintendo has released quite a few sports titles since the Famicom's debut in 1983, but Punch-Out is far and away the best. It's in a class by itself, really. It has, on occasion, been compared to a puzzle game rather than a typical sports game. Each boxer you fight has a series of standard punches as well as special moves. Fighters generally give some sort of sign before they throw a punch, like Piston Honda we saw there a moment ago, like slightly raises his eyebrows. Often the character will like flash a certain color, but you'll see some kind of on-screen indication telling you they're about ready to attack. And the first step is learning how to defeat a boxer is to sort of identify when they're going to attack you and then dodge. Now, when a boxer throws a powerful punch and you successfully dodge, you will usually have an opportunity to counterattack, often by stunning your opponent. King Hippo is a good example of a boxer needing sort of a special tactic to defeat. He keeps his weak spot, which is his bandaged navel, covered up. As he prepares to throw a strong punch, you can hit him in the face, which will cause him to lower his guard. You can then hit him repeatedly in the navel as he tries to pull up his pants. Not really sure what the whole deal with the navel is. I've seen the thing with 2 adhesive bandages covering navel and an X on other Japanese video game characters, in Proteus for example. Not really sure what that's supposed to indicate. Maybe trying to give the character an infantile quality? While quick reflexes are required for the game, the whole necessity of finding the weak spot makes it seem a lot different than some of the other boxing games we've seen, such as Ring King or Rocky. Punch-Out is light years ahead of those games in terms of quality and playability. Aside from the obvious considerations like the distinctive opponents, Punch-Out's controls and handling are far superior. Play Ring King, then Punch-Out, and it's like trying to go from steering a wheelbarrow to driving a sports car. Precise timing is required in the game, and the game delivers completely. If you fail at Punch-Out, it's entirely your fault. Wonky controls are not an issue. Boy, you really sort of hate this guy the way he flexes his pectoral muscles there. Why are so many boxers wearing like tiny spandex shorts as opposed to regular boxing shorts? Anyway, once you've defeated him, you then get to encounter the real champion, Mike Tyson himself. Some serious skills are required for Tyson. He punches very quickly and one punch will actually knock you out. At first he's seemingly unbeatable, but if you're quick enough, you can persevere. Now, Punch-Out was actually re-released in the US in 1990, this time without Mike Tyson. Tyson's sprite was slightly touched up and renamed Mr. Dream. In a rather ugly postscript, a follow-up was designed by Beam Software, Mike Tyson's Intergalactic Power Punch. Nintendo decided not to publish the game, and it was eventually released by American Softworks as Power Punch 2, with Mike Tyson's name removed. The game is really terrible, but I suppose it's a story for a future episode. It's often assumed that Tyson was removed from the game due to his arrest and conviction for rape, but that didn't occur until 1991. More than likely, the original agreement just expired and Nintendo didn't want to cough up any more cash to renew it. Tyson actually lost his title after being knocked down by Buster Douglas in early 1990, and his appeal was starting to fade. Punch-Out received a sequel for the Super Nintendo, and more recently a completely reworked version for the Wii. For such an immensely popular game, it's strange that Nintendo let this franchise lie dormant for so long. Here is the sad part of Chrontendo episode 24, the grand debut of LJN, the first US-based publisher to release games designed specifically for the US market. They released 3 games in October 1987, so let's start with Karate Kid. Now, LJN was a toy company that had been around since 1970. They released toys like Thundercats, Voltrons, all sorts of things. In 1986, they were bought by Universal Pictures, which naturally resulted in many movie spin-off games. Later, they were bought by Acclaim, and eventually shuttered in 1994. Their games are generally considered to be not good. Karate Kid is divided up into several types of gameplay. First is a series of 4 one-on-one battles, recreating the end of the first Karate Kid movie. You can pretty much defeat each of the 4 enemies simply by kicking them repeatedly. Fighting games weren't really too advanced in 1987, but this is terrible even by those standards. Now, don't expect any sort of cutscenes or plot delineation in this game. It's simply a series of unconnected segments based loosely on different parts in the movies. In the second level, and there are 4 total, this is where the game really falls apart. Danielson and Okinawa, you say? Well, it becomes clear this is not based on the original 1984 Karate Kid movie, but on the 1987 sequel. In this movie, Pat Morita and Ralph Macchio travel to Okinawa in order to do battle with greedy industrialists or something like that. Really, unfortunately, this game fails due to really bad controls. Though, however, there are these little breaks in the main gameplay. These little mini-games are almost like micro-games. I actually sort of like the presentation on that one, with the large-sized character and the rather fluid-looking animation. It's a bit more impressive than the main game. And you know, while Karate Kid is not that bad graphically, and there are some nice details and the music is actually presentable, it raises the question about these LGN games. LGN being a toy company, they didn't do any in-house development, so who actually did these? Well, they were generally contracted out people like Rare and sometimes Japanese developers. In this case, it seems that Atlus is responsible for the game, even though this does fall well below the quality of games like Biosenshi Dan or Megami Tensei. Atlus presumably subcontracted some of the work out to other folks. Oh, a little bug there, there's only ever 2 enemies on the screen at once, so if you have enemies behind you, you can simply walk forward, and you won't get attacked by any more enemies. And the first boss is just some boring guy in a brown shirt. Now, while the entire game suffers from insipid level design, it actually gets worse as it goes along. Level 3 is just like Level 2, only with a monsoon blowing, which is constantly pushing you backwards. And of course, naturally, you're also being pelted by little sticks in what are either small yellow birds or banana pills. The whole blowing wind thing was employed pretty well in other games like Ninja Gaiden 2, but here, combined with the game's terrible controls, it makes this level one of the most unpleasant experiences I've ever had on the Famicom so far. Seriously, I played the entire level through gritted teeth. The controls in the whole game are terrible, and I mean terrible. For example, your jump, it's done by pressing up on the D-pad, but it's pathetically short and rather silly looking. When you're hit by an enemy, you don't just get pushed back a bit, you're actually sent flying through the air. When 2 enemies start hitting you on both sides, you end up being bounced around like a pinball. Combine this with the awful jump in the wind, and you've got a seriously unpleasant gaming experience. I actually quit in utter disgust before finishing this level. Karate Kid is seriously not good. Now granted, there are some serious limitations on the sound capabilities of the NES, but is that really supposed to be the Jaws theme? Just like Karate Kid, Jaws is a property of Universal Pictures. Now while the game does not actually come out and say this game is clearly based not so much on the classic 1975 Steven Spielberg movie, but on the awful Jaws: The Revenge from 1987. Jaws: The Revenge has been widely mocked, especially for its tagline, "This time it's personal." So naturally, Jaws, the video game, is a terrible game, but at least it's very short. A quick check on YouTube turns up playthroughs that clock in at about 4 to 6 minutes, and these don't really require any sort of like fancy tricks, really. Now the object is simple. You have sort of this ship that you steer around on the overworld map, moving back and forth between the two docks. The actual map is very small. Occasionally you'll hit something, the game doesn't really specify what, and then you'll engage in these brief scuba diving sequences. You shoot the marine life, jellyfish and stingrays. Every so often they'll drop shells. Those are what you want to grab. After a minute of doing this, I guess you have to kill a certain number of enemies, you'll be back on the ship. Once you actually reach one of the ports, you can trade in the shells for something. The first thing you actually get is a tracking device that'll allow you to find Jaws. Doesn't really do that much, it just sort of makes a beeping noise when you get close to him. Basically you want to keep going back and forth between the two ports, trading in the shells that you get. This will actually start raising your power level. Once you've done this a few times, you'll be strong enough to actually defeat Jaws himself. Oh, and every so often you get these really annoying little bonus sequences in which you try to drop bombs on jellyfish. Which seems like a real waste of ammunition, quite frankly. Okay, once you've actually run into Jaws himself, you're going to have to defeat him with your spear gun. Now, while you're in the water with Jaws, you need to shoot him repeatedly. Oddly, the jellyfish themselves are actually more dangerous than Jaws. Now, one thing you can find that'll make the job a bit easier is a submarine. Once you've gotten Jaws' health down to 0, you need to complete one last brief section. As Jaws gets close, you need to drop these sort of depth charges, which will cause him to jump out of the water, and then you try to ram him with a boat. The timing on this is pretty tricky. You have to sort of be right at the exact distance from Jaws, and his fin has to be lined up precisely with the tip of your boat. You only have 3 of these explosives, which they call strobes, and if that doesn't work, you'll have to basically start again by defeating Jaws and bring his health back down. Now this is actually taken directly from the end of the Jaws: The Revenge movie. This is how they killed the shark in the movie. Oh, there we go. For some reason Jaws sinks down to the bottom of the sea. If he's dead, wouldn't he float? Now Jaws was actually developed by West 1, the same guys who did Wonder Boy for Sega, which was converted into Adventure Island by Hudson. And this game is, well, not up to the same standards set by Wonder Boy, that's for sure. All in all, a pretty terrible game. Our third and final LG in-game is a little different. Gotcha the Sport, which just happens to be a light gun game. Now this being an LG in-game, you must think this is based on a movie. Well, sort of. The game is based on paintball, one particular variant of which was called Gotcha back in the 1980s. A subsidiary of LJN, called Intertech, made various sorts of toy guns and related things, and came out with a home paintball game for kids under the name Gotcha the Sport. However, Universal, LGN's parent company, had also released a movie called Gotcha in 1985. Starring Anthony Edwards, the movie is about a young paintball enthusiast who gets caught up in some sort of international intrigue. Though Gotcha the Sport, the game, has nothing to do with this movie's plot. Instead, it's sort of a typical light gun game with a paintball theme. This means that when hit, the other gunmen put their hands up and march away, as opposed to blinking out of existence. Well, there is a bit more to Gotcha than that. You see, this is sort of like a capture the flag sort of game. The object is to get the other team's flag, which is always on the opposite side of the map from your flag. You can see it on the little map up there at the top. The unique thing about Gotcha is the screen doesn't scroll automatically, as in most other light gun games. No, you have to use the D-pad to move across the playing field. This means you have the light gun in one hand and the controller in the other. which will irritate those who like to look intense by holding the light gun in both hands like a real handgun. Your ammo is very limited. Oops, got shot there. So you sort of need to avoid firing wildly and make sure you shoot the ammo boxes when possible. Okay, so you go over, shoot the other team's flag, then march all the way back, get to your side, and then you have won the level. Then you move on to the next level, which is an urban-themed level, and after this there's a sort of snowy winterscape level. But the game quickly cycles back to the first level and repeats. One aspect not found in other light gun games is that you can avoid enemy fire by simply continuing to move until the other gunman is simply off the screen. This means you have to make a decision whenever a gunman appears. Keep moving and hope he doesn't have time enough to shoot you before disappearing, or stop moving and shoot him, or try to shoot him while still moving. Obviously this will make him a little harder to hit. All in all, Gacha is pretty good for a light gun game. There are actually elements of strategy involved. I don't know who developed this game, but it certainly is the best of the 3 LGN games this episode. While arcade games were not the cultural phenomenon they were in the early 80s, video arcades were still very much a viable business at that time, and all the major video game publishers were still putting most, if not all, of their resources into arcade games. We'll see that most games of the time fall into a set number of genres. Prior to the beat-em-up or fighting game explosion, the most prominent genres were shooters and platformers. Let's start by looking at one of the oldest established Japanese companies, Taito. Taito had a pretty good year, releasing a number of interesting games. Naturally, there were some sequels involved, such as the second Arkanoid game, or Rainbow Islands, the sequel to Bobble. Rainbow Islands gets a pretty big graphical upgrade and seems much more modern than the first Bubble game. Here, instead of bubbles, you kill your enemies with rainbows. Now that's insane. Taito also released a few fantasy-themed action platformers, like the Conan-inspired hack-and-slash Rastan. This game got a Sega Master System port for some reason. It seems somewhat similar to Rygar. Also Wardener, a cute variation on the same idea, with much more platforming. Here you throw a magical fire spell. We'll see a port of this for the FDS later. Ghosts and Goblins seems to be the archetype for these sorts of games, though presumably the success of the platformer-heavy Famicom had something to do with it as well. Taito also employed developer Topeland for 2 vertical shoot-em-ups. Flying Shark is a technically nice-looking game, but is absurdly hard, mostly due to the fact that waves of enemies all come in from the top and both sides all at once, with paths of bullets flying everywhere, including diagonally. All of this seriously reducing the space that you have to move around freely in. Twin Cobra was a sequel to Tiger Heli, which we've also seen ported to the NES. Twin Cobra, as the name implies, adds 2-player co-op. This game is quite similar to Flying Shark and features such Topeland trademarks as a super bomb that causes massive damage to all enemies within range, as well as ground enemies which you can be hit with your regular gun. And Twin Cobra is thankfully not quite as tough as Flying Shark. Military games were quite popular at this time. Another example is Operation Wolf, which has this great fetishistic opening sequence. He used one of those mounted positional guns found at arcades at the time. Still, positional gun or light gun games were not very common as they later became, so Operation Wolf sort of stood out back in 1987. Wolf earned several sequels and numerous ports. The idea behind the game is simple, pretty much shoot everything that moves. Now there were still a few old-fashioned top-down driving games being produced in 1987, but Sega's Outrun inspired more cutting-edge 3D driving games with lots of crazy sprite scaling. Top Speed is a fine example of the let's outdo Outrun style of game. One added feature, Nitrous, which provide quick bursts of speed. Also very cool was Continental Circuit, an F1 racing game, also known as a Continental Circus. The tracks were based on real-life racing tracks, and for added realism, other cars will throw off debris as they get damaged. Some versions had a built-in 3D viewfinder. And when you die, you get this huge impressive explosion with a tire flying right at you. It's pretty cool. One of Taito's big rivals from the get-go was Namco, whose Pac-Man challenged Space Invaders for arcade supremacy years earlier. Namco released a few sequels to earlier arcade hits in 1987, including Pac-Mania. Namco dropped the platforming from Pac-Land and instead went back to the original concept and made what is essentially a fancier version of Pac-Man. One obvious difference, you can't see the whole maze at once. This game might have been Namco's last real Pac-Man arcade game, I believe. Pac-Mania used the new Namco System 1 board, which debuted in this game, Shadowlands, yet another yokai-themed game. The Japanese love these apparently. The people trapped in the pit is pretty creepy looking. There are very light RPG elements in this game. You can buy items with the money you collect. We'll see this get ported a few times down the road. Namco also reworked their classic shooter Xevious into Dragon Spirit, which had a sort of unusual fantasy theme to it. I mean, at least unusual for shooters. While the game works very much like Xevious, it has a few power-ups added in, and it's more difficult, namely because your dragon is just so frickin' huge. Again, expect to see a port of this shortly. Now Sega, despite putting lots of time and energy into the Master System, continued to release top-notch arcade games in '87. West One and Sega teamed up again for a sequel to Wonder Boy, which was nothing at all like the first game. Instead of running around in a grass skirt, Wonder Boy now battles monsters in a fantasy setting and can wear armor and wield swords. Weird, but this is the direction the series went from here on out. Again, the influence of RPGs is making itself felt in arcades. You'll need to collect money in order to equip yourself with items, armor, weapons, and so on. This could almost be a console game, and we'll see a port, actually multiple ports of it eventually. Shinobi kicked off the well-loved ninja platformer series. What can you say here? You are a ninja and you're out to rescue some kids, because that's what ninjas do. They perform good deeds. Along the way you'll fight enemies that look kind of like copyrighted comic book characters. This game of course also spawned tons of sequels. Naturally, Sega released more entries in its series of Superscalar 3D games, Afterburner being the next game in the Superscalar family. Again, there's a military theme. This is actually Afterburner 2, which is simply a slightly improved version of Afterburner 1. Expect to see attempts at console ports very soon. A little different was Thunderblade, which alternated between top-down sequences and behind-the-jet views. Either way, the game employed a rather clever use of stacked sprites to make the buildings look three-dimensional. You'll notice there are sort of several flat layers, which move in such a way that gives the illusion of perspective. Actually very creative. Unfortunately, less successful was Heavyweight Champ, which had the bad luck of coming out the same year as Punch-Out for the Famicom. Sadly, this game is no Punch-Out, but it looks sort of decent, I suppose. Also, we have SDI, a trackball game in which you need to protect the world from nuclear destruction. The intro seems rather inappropriate in the post-9/11 world. Sega had also released Missile Defense 3D for the Master System, so I guess someone at Sega was really into the idea of trying to update Atari's Missile Command. Speaking of Atari, Atari games were still around, even though most of the big US arcade manufacturers are now being overshadowed by Japanese companies. Blasteroids was Atari's sequel to Asteroids, and is actually a pretty cool game. Some modern elements like power-ups and multiple stages have been added. Oddly, Industrial Light and Magic assisted with the computer graphics. I will admit it is a very nice looking game. Zybots was an oddball 3D maze game, and it's been almost completely forgotten. It was strange, playing it now it feels sort of like a predecessor to Wolfenstein 3D or other early first-person shooter games. Tengen created an NES port, but it was never released. Zybots was, I guess, a little ahead of its time. Bally Midway had a popular game with a 3-player Rampage in 1986, and Xenophobe was sort of a sci-fi follow-up. However, in Xenophobe, all 3 players can be in different rooms at once, thus resulting in the need for 3 different screens. However, Bally decided to simply divide the game's one screen into 3 horizontal slices. Interesting idea, but it leaves each player with a little tiny play area. Much worse was Spy Hunter 2. The game featured a 2-player mode and 3D graphics, but man, this looks terrible. And no relation to the much better Super Spy Hunter for the NES. Capcom continued to follow up the success of games like 1942 and Ghosts and Goblins with similar releases, such as 1943, which is very similar to 1942, but with a few things added, like a life bar, and of course the end-of-level bosses. the spread shot is quite handy. Still, nothing too impressive or innovative here. Black Tiger, aka Black Dragon, is a sword and sorcery game in the style of Ghosts and Goblins. As was the fashion, you collect money and buy items in the shops. You know, Black Tiger is actually a pretty fun little game, though it's certainly not as well remembered as Ghosts and Goblins, and it's also not as sadistically hard. Definitely worth trying this one out. Black Tiger should not be confused with Tiger Road, a somewhat similar game, though with a Chinese theme. There are tons of enemies, and thankfully you have a decent sized life bar, and you can pick up better weapons than the axe you start out with. Much like Black Tiger, this is an overlooked game that scored some computer ports, but never had any sequels. Much better known is Bionic Commando, the game whose NES port remains well loved to this very day. The arcade original, also known as Top Secret in Japan, isn't really that great, but the whole mechanical arm thing is original to say the least. Now be advised that other than the basic gameplay mechanics, the arcade Bionic Commando is completely different than the home version. So if you're familiar with that and you play this, you might be a little disappointed. And speaking of disappointment, there was also Street Fighter, Capcom's one-on-one fighting game. Most fighting games at this time were rough around the edges, and Street Fighter 1 is no exception. A very great looking game, but it's difficult to control, and the special moves like the fireball are very hard to pull off. And of course you only get the choice of 2 characters. Now if you've played Street Fighter 2, and you probably have, then prepare to be massively disappointed if you pick this game up. It's a real shame, and the speech is pretty awful as well. Now let's move on to Konami. They released one of 1987's big games, Contra. Yep, pure run-and-gun action. This is where it all started. For those who don't know, Contra is great-looking, fun, and pretty darned hard. You lose a lot of lives, and there are limited continues. The game is pretty short, but it's not that easy to make it to the end. Power-ups are essential, in particular the spread shot, a landmark in the world of overpowered weapons upgrades. Contra alternates between horizontal and 3D maze sequences, with bosses at the end of each level. Obviously, this was ported to the Famicom and NES, and became one of the all-time great games for that system. Naturally, Konami released other cool games like Ajax, which played a lot like Twin Cobra, only with a separate bomb button to attack ground enemies. Again, we see a very heavy military theme, especially in shooters, which mostly had sort of sci-fi setting until recently. Like the 2 title games, Ajax can get a bit hectic at times. Another long-forgotten Konami game, Batlantis. I guess it's a combination of Battle and Atlantis. This is actually an update on Space Invaders of all things. Except here, instead of fighting aliens, you're battling guys who want to attack your castle, including these one guys who will sort of run and climb up the walls. Very interesting game, and definitely worth checking out. Blades of Steel is a fine and rather dramatically named hockey game, and it also got a great home port on the NES. Certainly the best hockey game so far. Blades of Steel was fast, easy to control, and it had fights. Yep, you could smack around other players and get a fight started. Now that is really cool. Dark Adventure, on the other hand, was sort of an oddball title, a 3-person Gauntlet clone. Probably have not seen this game. The best thing might just be the cool intro, similar to the intros we've seen from Konami on the Famicom. Like Almana no Kaseki, one character is modeled after Indiana Jones. And besides the typical swords and bows, your characters can get flamethrowers, dynamite, and laser. This has never been ported to any system that I know of. Technos was a much smaller company, but they somehow managed to release one of 1987's biggest hits, Double Dragon, a follow-up to Renegade, whose Famicom port we've already covered. Double Dragon pretty much ignited the whole beat-em-up genre. Multiplayer beat-em-up games would become perhaps the dominant genre in arcades in the late 80s and early 90s. Virtually all of those games were following in Double Dragon's footsteps. Not nearly as huge, but still pretty cool, was Super Dodgeball, another Kunio-kun game. There aren't exactly a whole lot of dodgeball video games, so this one stands out a bit. And again, we're going to see a port to the NES. Among other smaller manufacturers, we have Irem, whose R-Type we just discussed last episode. R-Type was the most advanced shoot-'em-up released at this time. Graphics, controls, cool design, awesome weapons, R-Type had it all, and puts pretty much all other shooters to shame. Including Mr. Heli, a cute helicopter-based shooter from Irem. Why all the helicopter shooters, I wonder? I don't know. A fine little game, but certainly overshadowed by R-Type. One of the cool things was you can actually fire going in a vertical direction as well as horizontally. You'll need to destroy little blocks that you found have crystals that drop down. Tecmo released its classic football game, Tecmo Bowl, in 1987. The arcade version is a bit different from the NES release. It's for 4 players at once and had a super wide screen. Like Bionic Commando, the arcade version tends to be overlooked, simply because of the home version being so much more popular. While the arcade Tecmo Bowl is not as great as the home version, it's still pretty impressive for a 1987 football game. Mopping up a few stragglers, we have Guerrilla War from SNK, a follow-up of sorts to Akari. Guerrilla War has you playing as either Che Guevara or Fidel Castro. That's a pretty amazing idea for a game. In Japan, it was actually called Che Guevara. As for the game, well, it's a lot like Akari. SNK would start working on its Neo Geo system in 1988, and this would obviously be a bit of a game changer for the company. From Nihon Busan, also known as Nichibutsu, we have Karnov, another arcade game known for its NES port. Also for its title character, who really isn't your typical video game protagonist. A decent enough game in the Ghost and Goblins mode. Though this time, Nihon Busan or Nichibutsu's, their main focus really seems to be putting out sort of tons and tons of adult mahjong games. Well, that wraps up our overview of the arcade games of 1987. This is not all of them by any stretch of the imagination, but I think we've seen all or most of the major titles, with the big ones being Contra, R-Type, and Double Dragon. Now we'll return to the Famicom games. From Jalico, we have what appears to be a very minor title, Uchuusen Cosmo Carrier, Uchuusen meaning spaceship. The name seems a little redundant to me. But perhaps the game itself is a little redundant. We have 2 similar games this episode, the other being Artelius. Uchuusen is a typical first-person space shooter. This falls into the general category of Star Raiders type games. We've seen a few of these for the Famicom already. For example, the very similarly titled Cosmo Genesis from ASCII, which came out back in December 1986. In the US, it was called Star Voyager. The name Cosmo Carrier makes me wonder, was Jalico deliberately copying Cosmo Genesis? And if so, it's a rather odd choice for a game to rip off. As it is in other Star Raiders games, you fly around shooting enemy spacecraft. You can take a certain amount of damage, but eventually your ship will start failing. You can also warp to other areas. That's what the move button is for. However, there is one rather strange design decision. You have all those menus below. When you attack an enemy, your crosshair will lock onto them, and both you and the enemy will freeze while you select your attack options from the menu. For example, you have missile and beam. But while you are attacking one enemy, the rest are not frozen. No, they can still fly around and shoot you. So you kind of become like a sitting duck while you're trying to shoot down the enemy, which is actually very bizarre. Now, I'm sure there is perhaps a bit more to this game than this, or at least I certainly hope so, but Uchuusen doesn't really seem to sort of stick out from the pack of similar games. Here I've warped to the orange planet, and there are actually much tougher enemies flying around this one. Watching this, you can see exactly how the whole bit about you freezing while the enemies do not sort of hampers your ability to defend yourself. All in all, it's another sort of oddball title from Jalico. Hopefully the name Namco will inspire a bit more confidence than Jalico. Our next game gets right down to the point rather quickly with this kidnapped girl opening. A girl? Kidnapped? What a crazy idea for a video game. So this is Lupin III, Pandora no Isan. A Japan-only game. Luckily we have a very nice unofficial translation available from Vice Translations. In a thoughtful touch, the game begins with an arcade-like demo mode, with each character having an introduction and then a brief scene of them in action. The three main characters seen here are Lupin III, and his associates Daisuke Jigen and Ishikawa Goemon III, who's a samurai dude who is supposedly the descendant of the legendary thief, if you'll recall Konami's Ganbara Goemon game which featured Ishikawa Goemon I. Okay, so who is this Lupin guy? Well, odds are you already know, but just in case, Arsène Lupin was a gentleman thief from a series of books by the French author Maurice Leblanc. The character was very popular in the first part of the 20th century, with various Lupin movies being released, mostly before 1950. Then, in the 1960s, manga artist Monkey Punch created the Lupin III character, grandson of the original Lupin. Did this comic get made into an anime? Well, what do you think? Numerous TV shows and movies have been made, most famously The Castle of Cagliostro, the first film directed by Miyazaki. Scenes from that movie were used to make the Laserdisc video game Cliffhanger. Folks who are familiar with the animated series might know the name was usually pronounced Lupin, as opposed to Lupin, since that is the closest equivalent in Japanese. So Lupin III is a run and jump and shoot sort of game. We've seen many games similar to this, and like so many games of the era, it's a little incoherent. Like, who are all these guys shooting at Lupin, and what's with the cats? Why do all the cats want to kill him? And if this guy is such a great thief, I mean, how could he even get killed by a cat anyway? Despite all this, the game works pretty well. Lupin can take only one hit before dying, but collecting armored jackets will enable him to take an additional hit. And I do like the cool way that Lupin can pick up speed running down roofs and leap onto the next building. The jumping controls are pretty decent, and considering how bad jumping hampers so many games of this era, it's quite an accomplishment. Now one thing is, when you die, you have to select one of the remaining characters. Jigen, seen here, has a more powerful gun, but he can't use all the items. The game comprises 4 relatively long levels. One thing I'll be doing a lot is entering rooms and checking to see if there's any other characters or any special items in there. As a rule, you find items in those little white things, which I suppose are supposed to be briefcases. Among the various things you'll find will be infrared goggles, bombs to find hidden passages, special limited-use weapons, all kinds of interesting things. Now, while the game is reasonably playable, there are moments that do seem a little bit stupid. The enemy AI is pretty non-existent. And from time to time, various sorts of gameplay issues will pop up that'll cause you to pull your hair out. Here, for example, I tried switching characters before entering the boss room. But when I did this, Inspector Zenigata appeared right next to me, thus leading to an unavoidable, unfair death. Now, sort of like Mega Man, the bosses are made much easier if you use the right character. I'll go inside the room and then switch to Jigen. He can shoot all the way across the screen, thus rendering the boss pretty much helpless. Another cool little touch is a little bit of dialogue after the boss is defeated, that sort of moves the plot forward and gives justification for the next level. Compare this to something like Karate Kid, which is just a bunch of sort of random crap thrown together. The game was co-developed by Namco and Tosa, of all people. I'll assume Namco was responsible for all the good parts, and Tosa for the rest. Certainly this stands well above other Tosa products like the second Kinnikuman game, for example. However, don't be mistaken into thinking that Lupin is some sort of forgotten classic. It can be quite aggravating in spots, but it does hold up surprisingly well, especially compared to its contemporary licensed games. What? I have no idea what this has to do with the game. Well, the Famicom has a pretty slim release schedule in November so far. We're already halfway through the month. Last episode we had all those RPGs, as you recall. Well, RPGs will keep on coming, and here's this episode's Artelius. The plot is detailed in this rather groovy English-filled introduction. In short, you're a cyborg created to save humanity from evil alien forces. So it's a space version of pretty much every RPG plot. Now, don't get too excited if you were expecting some sort of science fiction RPG epic. Artelius is more like Zoids in space. Now, one nice thing about this game, there's actually plenty of save spots. More than you'll ever use, trust me. This game starts out with you, instead of getting orders from the king, you start talking to some very chatty computers. This guy actually goes on for quite a while. What I don't know is, why is he shaped like the White House? After him, you'll end up talking to 2 more computers, who both have quite a lot to say. Seriously, this is sort of like the Metal Gear Solid 2 of Famicom games so far. Eventually, you'll get around to assigning your attribute points, and every time you level up, a couple of your attributes will go up as well, automatically. It's not like Ultima. Now, I call this an RPG. That's really only because of the character building aspect. The structure of the game is pretty linear and consists of levels. You move from level to level by finding these warp points. Just found the first one there, and I'm on level 1 now. Here's my stats. So we're in space, but the rows of impassable asteroids turn the level into what's essentially a dungeon. You can't quite roam around like you can on the overworld of most RPGs. Invisible enemies are flying around, constantly coming and going. And once you collide with an enemy, you'll engage in some one-on-one combat. And you can see here why I said the game resembles Zoids. Both games have battle zone-like combat. Of course here, the enemy ships can move up and down and all over, so I guess it's actually quite similar to Star Raiders. Star Raiders first came out in 1979, and 8 years later is still being widely borrowed from. At any rate, I'm sure by now you know the drill. Shoot the other spaceship, get some experience points and some money. After a few battles, U class will increase to 2. Though annoyingly, when you level up, your health is not replenished. Seriously, that should be a law, that RPGs have to replenish your health whenever you level up. Dragon Quest and similar games do this, but some RPGs with old school attitude do not. I love the fact that the first outpost looks just sort of like a house floating in space. This guy will sell you stuff and refill your energy and whatnot. Anyway, what you're actually looking for in the first level is the warps that go into level 2. And what's the exciting thing about level 2? Well, when you get there, there's a space station. Hooray! Again, a lot of the enemies look a little goofy here. These look like guys sort of flying around in like space scooters or something like that. Ah, here I found the warp, and we're on to level 2. Now, so far all this is pretty boring looking, but other things happen later on. You get to land on planets and do that sort of thing. Space station is not hard to find. And this takes the place of your typical RPG village. Oh, and that's a weird looking guy right there. There is an escape function. Those guys can be a bit tough at times. Now, the character designs in this game are actually pretty decent, even though they're clearly inspired by Star Trek. I guess this is sort of the distant ancestor of Mass Effect. Artelius was developed by Nihon Busan aka Nichibusu. RPGs are not really their forte, but at least the presentation is nice in spots. Oh yes, and here's what you've been waiting for all this time. Yep, the cat girl has now been officially introduced into console gaming. Or at least I assume that's a girl. Well, Artelius suffers from a lot of the same issues as other low-grade early RPGs. It's repetitive, the levels are bland and empty, you level up slowly, and the game will randomly throw way too powerful enemies at you. Like this guy, he's some sort of space bug. Add in the rather irritating space combat, I mean these guys are really hard to hit, and you have a game that doesn't hold up very well. Another FDS game, Tanigawa Kouji no Shougi Shinan 2. And whoa, who are those guys? I don't think we ever get to find out. Rather exciting intro for a Shougi game. Yep, this is the third Shougi game we've encountered. The last one was Marita Shougi from Random House. Same guys who did Hoshi no Mirohitu. This and Ida Yosuka's Mahjong game from a couple episodes back underlies a trend we're starting to see, getting well-known individuals to lend their names to Famicom games. Here, it's Tanigawa Kouji, a Shogi player who rocketed to fame by becoming a top-ranked player at a young age. This is the second of his Shogi games. The first was released for the MSX by Pony Canyon in 1986. Tanigawa looks really pissed at you in this game. Alright, so what's going on with this game here? Well, as I've mentioned before, Shogi is a Japanese version of chess. Both chess and Shogi originated from the same ancient game. It's very similar to chess, but different enough that knowing how to play chess will not really help you too much when it comes to Shogi. As the name Shougi Shinan indicates, this is an instructional Shogi game. Aside from playing against the computer, there's also an option where Tanigawa assists you in your Shogi strategy. I guess this must have sold okay since there was a sequel, and the game was also re-released on cartridge in 1988. We're almost done here, folks. But wait, what's this? Another Nihon Falcom game? Well, not really. Faxanadu, sort of based on Falcom's Xanadu. And the game has a rather nice intro here, very clearly in the style of Bomber King. Faxanadu starts off with a rather interesting fashion. Contrary to standard RPG rules, your character actually speaks. We have him providing some of the narration. You return to your home village, finding it nearly in ruins. So what's going on? Well, much like Bomber King, the land is in bad shape due to some sort of ecological devastation. Semi-apocalyptic scenarios seem disturbingly popular in Japan at this time. The idea of a village suffering from some sort of drought or disease or curse has turned up in a lot of other games, like Romancia, Hoshi no Mirohidu, Momotaro Densetsu, Castlevania II, and many others. Must be something ingrained in the Japanese psyche. Talking to the locals, you'll find that your elf village is in trouble due to damage done to the world tree. The whole giant mystical tree thing would turn up from time to time in RPGs, such as in the Seiken Densetsu games. Alright, let's get this out of the way. While Faxanadu has some well-executed graphics, the character portraits can be a bit creepy. They're animated, but what's with those blinking eyes? My god, stop doing that, Blinky McBlinkerston. You're sort of freaking me out. Yeah, problems with the wells again. Didn't we go through this earlier this episode? Well, as you probably know, Xanadu was the second game released in Falcom's Dragon Slayer series. Originally released in 1985 for Japanese computers such as the PC-88. This version right here is the MSX version from 1987. Same game, but with somewhat improved graphics. Dragon Slayer 3, Romancia, clearly looks a lot like this game, and the original Xanadu does play a lot like Romancia. Xanadu was probably one of the first successful RPGs for Japanese computers. A huge hit. It also was quite involved and borrows things from Western RPGs like food, and there are tons of items in your typical D&D character stats, but the gameplay is side-scrolling action RPG style. Oh yeah, and the first dungeon is notoriously hard to find. Typical Falcom sadism, I suppose. So what about Faxanadu? Well, the RPG elements have been greatly simplified and streamlined. This really has little to do with the original Xanadu game. It's pretty much an entirely new game that uses a few ideas from Falcom's title. It was actually designed by Hudson, and seems much more like a standard console action RPG than something like Romancia. It kind of resembles Castlevania II, and the name is a portmanteau of Famicom and Xanadu. And you will find your standard villages, filled up with shops, doctors, taverns, and so on. These are connected by these enemy-filled passages, and you will encounter doors to dungeons along the way. Now here I'm in the first dungeon. Naturally, you need to defeat the enemy at the end in order to get the Matic. You need to break a wall outside the dungeon. That's the game's general structure. Move forward, find the way blocked, look for an item, talk to an old man or something, get the passage unblocked, and then go forward. While Hudson has modernized the gameplay, Faxanadu is far from perfect. The boss battles are either very easy and very boring, like here, or they're hella tough, like when you have to fight one of these things when there's no helpful little ledge to stand on. Each of those fireballs will take off a huge chunk of your health. And the fact that your original dagger has no range doesn't help. Another issue, the enemy's placement and erratic movements can be pretty irritating. You will frequently find yourself entering a room and then immediately be hit by a lurking enemy, like when I exit this door here. Even worse is when an enemy is located near the edge of a screen and hits you and pushes you back into the previous room every time you try to enter the room. Though there are some cool moments. Like here, for example, you need to equip these wing boots, giving you temporary flight. Why? Well, you gotta talk to this old guy who lives up in the sky. Though it's not clear whether this really takes place inside or outside. The setting of the game is very strange. Supposedly this all occurs inside the world tree, but why did they build all these stone walls and dungeons inside a tree? Oh yeah, when you finally get to this old guy, he attempts to tell you where to go next, but it comes across as complete gibberish. I guess this is sort of a problematic localization. Unfortunately, most of the other characters' dialogue comes across as vague or just plain nonsensical. Now, Hudson has reduced the RPG elements to a bare minimum. There are a few types of weapons and armor, as well as healing potions, and you need to actually buy your magic. And also you need to buy keys. There are special keys for opening all the doors. There are key shops inside the villages. The experience system is pretty odd. You do get experience points, but leveling up doesn't increase your character stats at all. When you die, you are resurrected at the last church you visited, and most of your money will be gone. The only thing that your level affects is how much gold you'll have when you get resurrected. That's certainly a unique idea. It doesn't affect your HP or anything like that. Now, clearly when Hudson redesigned this game, they completely altered the art style. Faxanadu's graphical design is one of the most striking things about this game. The backgrounds are very detailed, some of the best looking for the system, and the game uses some never-before-seen effects, like here in this smoky, polluted level, where everything is obscured by the murk. But the color palette can be a bit distressing, since it uses so many browns, tans, and yellows in places. Faxanadu is almost monochromatic in spots, and a lot of the enemies are just one color. Well, I would hesitate to call Faxanadu a great game. There are too many nagging little issues, but it is a solid attempt to update Xanadu for a home console and features some of the most interesting art design we've seen so far. We're down to the final game this episode, and as usual, it's an odd one. Kick Challenger Airfoot. But what the hell is this? I don't think this game is officially licensed by Nike, but yet it seems this game is trying to cash in onto the sudden popularity of Air Jordans, which were first rolled out in 1985. Most alarming, however, is the name VAP in the credits. The only other VAP game we've seen is Super Monkey Daiboken, which has the honor of being the worst game so far released on the Famicom. At least in my opinion. Super Monkey Daiboken was almost an anti-game. Well, Kick Challenger couldn't possibly be that bad, but it is pretty weird. So, you play a tomato with feet. And not just any feet, but sort of like these gigantic Sasquatch-style feet. They aren't really attached to your body, they just kind of, you sort of float over your feet. And each foot is controlled separately. That is, you move a foot using the D-pad, and then you hit a button, the A button, to switch feet. So in order to walk, you sort of alternate up, A, and so on. It's awkward, but at least it is a rather original method for moving around your character. You can also kick enemies with your feet by using the B button, and make sure you're aware of which foot is actually active. I was trying to constantly kick an enemy on one side, but when I hit the attack button, I realized the other foot was the foot that kicked. So Kick Challenger is the first shoe fetish game for the Famicom. Kicking rocks and mushrooms will reveal power-ups, including different types of shoes, some with the Nike swoosh clearly visible. And once you find your way out of the level, you battle a boss, and this guy's actually rather impressive looking. No idea who'd really developed this game, but it is a huge step up from Super Monkey Daiboken. The graphics are bright and cheery, and they actually resemble the objects they're supposed to represent most of the time. VAP sure took their time in putting this thing out. Their last game, Super Monkey Daiboken, was released almost exactly a year ago, on November 21st, 1986. Kick Challenger is not great, but once you get used to the weird controls, it's really not that bad. Once again, thanks for watching. Next time we go deeper into the 1987 holiday season as we reach December. Would you believe it's another Konami-heavy episode? Another highlight is a weird game from Namco based on a very popular movie, and one of the most ridiculous Famicom Disk System releases ever, from Data East. We'll see you then.